Barak-Gorodetsky is able to join us. I'm going to give maybe about 2 more seconds for some more folks to show up, since it looks like people are still coming in. All right, well, we should probably get started, just because, you know, time, we only have so much of it. Again, thank you guys, so much, for coming today. We are joined by Rabbi Dr. David Barak-Gorodetsky. He is an Israel Institute teaching fellow at the University of Chicago's Divinity School, and he is a scholar of the history of modern Jewish history, and particularly, his work has focused on Judah Magnes, and this was the focus of his book, which is titled Jeremiah in Zion, the Religion and Politics of Judah Magnus, which is going to be coming out this year in English. It actually was previously published in Hebrew, but it's being published in the English translation this year, and it's a biography of Magnus, who was an American Reform rabbi who promoted binationalism in pre-state Israel and Palestine. And so I'm really thrilled that, that Dr. Barak-Gorodetsky is able to join us virtually anyway. From Chicago, I would love to have him in person with us, but that's just not possible these days. He's going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes or so about Judah Magnes, which I'm really excited about. And then there will be an opportunity for us to discuss American Zionism and Magnus's sort of role in terms of the development of that, as well as his sort of ideas about binationalism and so on and so forth. I just wanted to mention that we are recording this just so that people who aren't able to join, because this is also kind of an event for the public that normally people would come to. So we're gonna be posting this afterwards, so we are recording it. Again, thank you, for joining us, and Dr. Barak-Gorodetsky, take us away. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say and then having a chance to talk about it.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Jason, for the introduction. Thanks also Galit and the Schusterman Center for hosting this event. I also would have preferred to be in person. In Israel, most people have already been vaccinated, and we keep on seeing pictures of weddings and events, and so hopefully we'll have open opportunities to some kind of a live meeting maybe after the book is published, but it's great to be with you now. I want to speak for about 15 minutes on Judah Magnes. I'm going to share slides. Just a minute. Okay, I hope you can see the slides. So I want to talk about Judah Magnes, first of all, within the context of where your course on American Judaism is at the moment. I understand you're currently addressing the issue of early American Zionism, and I want to that would be the vantage point for our discussion. And then I want to move forward into 2 other fields, which are binationalism and political theology, that relate to the work of Magnus. I'll be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then Jason will be asking me some questions, and hopefully you will have some questions as well. So who was Judah Magnes? I've also understand that some of you have, or most of you have received 2 articles I had sent. One is a speech by Magnus of 1909. Another one is an article about Judah Magnes. This is the temporary mock-up cover of the book with a new name, Judah Magnes, The Prophetic Politics of a Religious Binationalist, which I think kind of already informs us in many ways about his views and where the discussion is possibly going. I want to start by giving you just a short, abridged biography about this person we see here called Judah Magnes. Then I want to move into the issue of American Zionism, especially the Jewish-American debate about American Zionism. American Zionism was not was not necessarily warmly received in the Jewish-American context, and that's something to be discussed. And then I want to branch into binationalism and maybe address the issue of political theology in the Q&A. Political theology essentially being the question of how religious views influence political thought and action. Okay, so let's get going. So who was Magnus? I want to just a short abridged biography of Magnus. He was born in Oakland in California, 1878. He's the first Reform rabbi born west of the Mississippi. He's the native son of California, so they call him when he's ordained. He's ordained in Cincinnati, which is then the center of Reform Judaism at the time. He does his PhD studies in Berlin. Eventually, he finishes his PhD in Heidelberg in Semitic studies. And then he comes back to the US to be a Reform rabbi in 3 congregations in which he has essentially very short-lived tenures on account of 2 things. First of all, on account of his Zionism, which we will address in a minute. And secondly, which was not a common view within the Reform movement at the time. And second, because he was a bit more of a conservative Jew than a Reform Jew. And he was actually supposed to lead the conservative movement when it was established in 1910, but that didn't materialize for various reasons. He's also the founder of an organization called the Kehila, which is the first umbrella organization of Jewish congregations and other organizations in New York, okay? So he goes back to the US, becomes a rabbi, leaves his congregation in Temple Emmanuel in 1910. And in 1917, he becomes a founding member of the People's Council for Democracy and Peace, this is the year that the US enters the First World War in April. And this organization is founded in order to promote pacifism. He's a pacifist, he's a religious pacifist. He's the most notable Jewish religious pacifist in that organization in 1917. Following his enrollment into that organization, he's actually shunned away by the Jewish establishment because it's a bit of a problematic position to be a pacifist on behalf of Jewish causes once the US enters the war eventually in 1917. So he is essentially kicked out of the Jewish American established. He moves to Palestine initially without knowing what he will do there. And then he's offered the opportunity to be the founder, essentially the founder and the first chancellor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which is the first university in Israel. In 1929, he becomes politically active by publishing a binationalist platform, which is called Like All the Nations. I will be showing part of that in a minute. And then he goes on to promote binationalism in Palestine in the 1930s and 1940s. In 1946, he testifies with Buber in front of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, calling for a binational solution in Palestine. And in 1948, he passes away in October in New York after the state had been established in May. And after 10 days prior to the establishment of the state, he meets with President Truman, trying to convince him not to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel and not to support the partition solution that was presented by the UN at the time. And then he passes away after the state is established, just a few months while in New York. Okay, so this is like his general kind of biography. I want to address the issue of American Zionism by showing 2 short texts and also a picture. So this picture is from a synagogue called She'erit Israel in San Francisco, which was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And this shows essentially, does anybody maybe have an idea what mountain we are seeing? Where does Moses descend from? Any thoughts? You can unmute yourself. Sorry?
Is it Mount Sinai?
It was supposed to be Mount Sinai, right? But what is it actually? It's a bit difficult to see in this picture, but this is the Half Dome in Yosemite, okay? So Moses is descending from this is a San Francisco synagogue. Moses is descending from the Half Dome in Yosemite. And when he arrives at the land, supposedly at the land beneath his feet, when he goes down the mountain, you see flags of essentially the American people, tribes are awaiting him once he descends, okay? So this is to say, for certain reasons, which I will demonstrate now, especially the Reform movement was objected to Zionism, and they say it very, very bluntly in this 1898 platform published by the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which reads as following: "We are unalterably opposed to political Zionism. The Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. Zion was oppressor's possession of the past. As such, it is a holy memory, but it is not our hope of the future. America is our Zion. Here is the home of religious liberty. We have aided in founding this new Zion, the fruition of the beginning laid in the old. The mission of Judaism is spiritual, not political. It aims not to establish a state, but to spread the truth of religion and humanity throughout the world." So this is essentially a reform, anti-Zionist early platform, which essentially says, this is our Zion. America is our Zion. We've founded the new Zion here. We don't need another Zion. Magnus was one of the early, what some call converts to Zionism in the Reform movement, who adapted a different form. And I can, again, there's an ideological element I'll refer to just shortly. This is essentially part of the American Reform universal point of view. And the way universalism, the perception of Judaism as a universal religion and not as a people, nationhood-oriented religion, Magnus thinks differently. And he in this short text, I want to show like the three main tenets of American Zionism that are demonstrated in his words. Jason, can you maybe help me and read this out a bit?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So Magnus this is a sermon. Yes.
Sermon in Temple Emmanuel in 1909. Just read them number by number. Okay.
Yeah. So number one, for myself, I would say America and Zion. America for the thousands who can live as Jews here. Zion for the thousands who must live as Jews there.
Okay. So this is the form. This is the first form of American Zionism, essentially perceiving Zionism as a safe haven for Jews outside of America. Okay.
Yeah. Number two, anti-Semitism, what is true, be of itself sufficient reason for the creation of a Jewish fatherland, the existence of which would remove one of the chief causes of anti-Semitism. Pessimism as to the outlook here would also be sufficient reason for the fatherland. But while these two powerful elements are not to be overlooked, they are not the higher motive of Zionism.
Okay, so element number two, Zionism as a counterdote or antidote to anti-Semitism, like essentially normalizing the Jewish people as people who have a land and a nation. And number three.
Right. Number three, Zionism is the desire not so much for the mere preservation of Jewish religion and Jewish nationality. These can and will be preserved here. Zionism is rather, and by here I think he means America, right? Yeah. Zionism is rather the desire for the live and unhampered and harmonious further development of Jewish nationality and Jewish religion. Zion is the complement to the fulfillment of America, not its alternative. Zion is the foundation stone and the capstone of the whole structure. It is our duty and our privilege to preserve and develop Judaism in America to the utmost of our powers. The difficulties are great. That does not excuse our ceasing to try. What we cannot do here, Zion will help us to do. Revive and develop our national life and make it fuller and finer than it ever was. Okay,
so this is essentially an Echad Ha'am Zionist view, a cultural Zionism view, which says, perceives American Judaism and Israel as two complementary centers in the evolvement of Judaism, and sees Zionism as something that can assist American Judaism in its own preservation and its own cultural renewal. Magnus is critical of American Judaism's situation at the time, and he sees Zionism, and many early Zionists echo that view, as something that can kind of improve the engagement of Jews at the time with their own Jewish identity and with their own Jewish culture, and kind of an harmonious kind of together with a center in the land of Israel. So this is, we'll discuss more of this later, but this is like essentially the essential view of American Zionism at the time. And again, in debate with a Reform view, which is universalist and is concerned about this nationality aspect of Judaism. And the second part, which I want to address, essentially has to do with Magnus's binationalism. Before I show just a little bit from his 1929 platform, I wanted to point out the fact that quite a few of the notable Jewish American immigrants to Palestine in the period of the British Mandate were actually American and were actually binationalists, sorry. So we have Henrietta Sold here on the left of the screen, the woman sitting, that's Henrietta Sold, the founder of Hadassah, which was herself a binationalist, and the organization Hadassah, which is essentially a medical organization, also had a committee for promoting binationalism in the 1940s. So Hadassah is a binationalist in many ways organization. We have a person called Klieger, which had to do with eradicating malaria in Palestine, who supported binationalism. And in the third picture, we have a woman, the shorter woman is called Jessie Santer. She's a Jewish American poet. This is her same-sex partner, Leah Berlin. They lived together in Rehovot and later moved to Kibbutz Givat Brenner and adopted 2 kids. So she was a poet and a supporter of binationalism in and of itself at the time. So many of the Jewish Americans immigrating to Palestine are binationalists, and why? So I want to just point us in the direction of further discussion by pointing to 2 quotes from Magnus, from his pamphlet Like All Nations, which was published in December 1929, which is in the aftermath of the Western Wall riots in August 1929, in which there was violence between Jews and Arabs in Palestine following those riots. And this is essentially a platform which can point to 1 or 2 aspects of his binationalism, and I'll talk about more when we get into the Q&A. I'll just read the main quote, first of all, that's on the page here. It is right in morals, insofar as political forms have anything to do with morals at all, that the people of this and every other country should have a voice in their own government. And it is not possible, even if it were desirable, to maintain the present status quo. The Jewish conscience will not bear this for long. It must recognize sooner rather than later, and from goodwill rather than through compulsion, that the inhabitants of this country, both Arab and Jews, have not only the right, but the duty to participate in equitable and practical ways in the government of their common land. This is essentially the cornerstone of his binationalist platform, which, again, there's much more to say about this, but just to point to a few things we can discuss later on, this is a claim about morals and politics. And it is a claim that morals do have a place in politics. And it is a claim that those morals are religiously derived or motivated. And essentially, much of Magnus's view is to say that the Jewish prophetic morals, or the morals presented by the prophets, this is why Gershom Shalom says he has a Jeremiah complex, okay? The morals presented by the prophets should lead the way in the realization of political reality, sometimes against more practical considerations. And also he demonstrates here an American form of pragmatism in believing that, this can actually be manifested by what he later claims should be a parliamentary system, which he would like to copy from the American parliamentary system, which has both a Senate and a Congress. So he's suggesting some kind of similar aspect. And the third thing, which I want to finish with, is the quote, another quote, which has to understanding the religious nature of binationalism, in which it says the following: the Holy Land is no place for an Arab national state or government, but for or a Jewish, by the way, that's the other part of the sentence, but for a binational country with a mandate as nearly permanent as possible held by Great Britain from the League of Nations. This is to say 2 things. One is the idea that the Holy Land is holy to an extent that nationalism should not reside there, okay? Nationalism is a profanity or sacrilegious in relation to the religiousness of the land, or the religious nature of the land. That's one claim. And the other, more practical claim, just points to the way in which Magnus and many others were concerned about Great Britain's departure from Palestine, and they actually opted to keep Great Britain in their eventual practicality of relating to the land. So this was a short introduction to Magnus, both in terms of his Zionism and his binationalism, and I'll give it back to you, Jason, and see what we want to discuss.
All right. Thank you, so much, first of all, for that brief introduction, that brief overview of Magnus, sort of his biography, as well as some of the details of his Zionism and so on and so forth. And I hope that we'll have a chance now for the rest of the time that we have to have a discussion about Magnus and about what we learn from him, right? About as we think about the development of American Zionism, and then also the contribution that American Jews, would later have in terms of the development of, Palestine, British Palestine in the 1920s and 30s and so on. So I guess, I want to get us started just with a question, a follow-up question, and then we can open it up for everybody, to sort of like ask questions about Magnus, what they were thinking about, especially, students had a chance to look at some of the materials that Professor Barak-Gorodetsky shared with us as well. I guess the thing that maybe you can say a little bit more about is what does it mean, right? When you see sort of the development of this reform Zionism, in the sense that, as you said, he is American born. He's coming from San Francisco, the San Francisco Bay Area. He, is a student at Hebrew Union College, in Cincinnati, which is really this bastion of anti-Zionism, especially in the 1900s. And he comes out with this, kind of very different approach that, like you said, gets him canned effectively from his job. And so can you maybe say a little bit more, is he really on his own here, right? Is there other American Zionists like Stephen Wise, for instance, who's based in New York and has his own rabbinical school, the Jewish Institute of Religion. So how does Magnus fit into the broader development of Zionism in America?
Okay, great question, thanks. So first of all, we kind of need to, I think, understand why the American, just to expand on why the American reform movement is against Zionism in general, just on a theoretical basis, understanding this as two different reactions to Jewish modernity, two different Jewish reactions to modernity. And essentially the reform reaction to modernity earlier in Germany and then later in the US has to do with adopting emancipation and adopting the idea that the Jews can be nationally integrated into other societies, the German society or the American society, while maintaining their religious identity. That's why they are so, vocal about the idea that the Jews are not a people, but a religion. And Zionism is actually reviving the idea of Jewish peoplehood, which creates a bit of a challenge for the reform point of view. First of all, in terms of what would later emerge as concerns about issues such as dual loyalty, or what does it mean to be part of a Jewish people and of an American people? And the reform movement is very much concerned with two things. One is integration into American society, and the other one is maintaining Judaism at the same time. And Zionism is perceived in that sense as a threat. So that's the initial point of view. What Magnus and other Zionists of the time, and you noted, there's Stephen Wise from New York, which is a noted Zionist at the time. There's a few others, Bernard Pleasantal, and some other so-called converts to Zionism in the reform movement, and especially Abba Hillel Silver, which is you might get to him later in your course, which is an important character in the involvement of the State of Israel, a reform rabbi as well. And they adopt a different platform, mostly on account of two things. Mostly on account of the fact that and this is very apparent in Magnus's view, they don't think American Judaism is working the way it is at the time. They think something is wrong with American Judaism. Magnus complains about young Jews being estranged from their tradition. They think there is an idea, a feeling of a demise of American Judaism, and they want to kind of revitalize that. So that's kind of the internal American aspect of that. And then there is the real concern about the fate of the Jews in Europe. These are the times of the pogroms in 1905, 1903. These are early, this is the period we're talking about, and there is actual concern about the fate of American Jews. And there is another less apparent aspect to this, which is not always addressed, which is the fact that they were, to some extent, concerned. This actually supports some of the American Zionist supporters were actually concerned about the increased immigration into the US of Jews at the time, and the way it put, because these were Ostjuden, these was Jews coming from Russia and from Eastern Europe, which did not necessarily bode well with the very integrated form of Jewish identity of the Reformed German congregations. And they actually wanted to promote Zionism within the immigrants as a form of alternative to immigration to the US in the future or at the same time. So these are this is kind of the basics of that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's a lot of things that I could ask to follow up for that, but I want to give the students and other people who are here the chance to ask questions as well.
Sure, I'd love to hear questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, Leo, I saw you raised your hand. So go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So from the point of view of Judah Magnes, it seems like he had kind of two different concepts of Palestine. One as sort of a safe refuge for the Jewish people, the nation of Jews, to live, and the other one was like as a holy land, kind of for the Jewish religion. And I was wondering how those ideas combined in his concept of what Zionism was.
Thanks. That's a great question. In a way, there's something that evolves in his view of Zionism once he moves from the U.S. to Palestine in 1922-23. So that's something that we need to take into account. I think there's, prior to him moving to Palestine, he is rooted within the Jewish American, establishment, and he maintains this view of Zionism as essential to American development and essentially this kind of Americanized view of Zionism. And he speaks less about the Holy Land as a concept until he moves to Israel. And when he moves there, a few things happen. First of all, he gets very tied into this A.D. Gordon. I don't know if you might have spoken about Gordon, but you might speak about later. Gordon is like a Jewish pioneer farmer who's very related to the land. And there's a lot of talk about connecting to the land itself. So this becomes like a physical object for him. And he also lives in Jerusalem, which is very much, with all it stands for. So something about his Holy Land kind of attitude evolves later on. And what essentially, this is eventually integrated into his binational idea that says something like the following: we need a state in Israel, Palestine, both as a safe haven and for the cultural involvement of Judaism. But we have a problem we have not addressed it seriously enough, which is that there is another people in Palestine. We need a solution, and the solution has to be a just solution. Jews can only afford politically moral, just solutions. That's essentially his view, and that is amplified by the fact that this is actually a religious country anyway. So why do we even need this nationalism? This has to do with concern about nationalism that evolves, especially after the First World War, which is perceived as a war that was kind of triggered by excessive nationalism. So this all ties into eventually to his binationalism platform. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Rachel, I saw you also had raised your hand before. Did you want to ask something as well?
Yes, I was just, first of all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, fantastic. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you. I was just curious about some of the objections to Zionism from Judaism. I understand that they thought that like Zion was kind of a thing of the past. But I was curious as to why exactly that is, if they're saying that Judaism is not about establishing a state, but like spreading the truth in the religion. But why exactly are they saying that Zion should remain a distant memory rather than more of a present day thing?
Okay, great. That's a great question. Thanks. So I want to start with a bit of a practical aspect regarding the way they perceived Israel and Palestine prior to the British Mandate and prior to the Balfour Declaration. Because, and this is, let's say that declaration is from 1898, okay? Their perception, there is something Orientalist in their perception of Palestine prior to the British Mandate, okay? Because there is a Reform rabbi called Wursanger that says something like along the following lines: I don't believe God's intention is that the Jewish people need to be as neighbors of Mongol tribes at the edge of civilization. Okay, this when there is an Ottoman rule of Palestine, Zionism is perceived as a non-practical Orientalist dream tied into a form of religious identity that they associate with the past. They associate it with Europe. They associate it with, and this ties into this very strong idea of progress and progressivism in American Judaism and in American culture in general, and in the Reform movement. The Reform movement perceives itself as the beacon of progress. This is the progressive age, okay? And there is a very strong conception that we need to move forward and progress and reform institutions and forms of practice. And this entire concept of a land and a people and also a temple, okay, which is against the Jewish, the Reform. The Reform do not acknowledge the priestly, like priests as having different rights in Jewish tradition. This does not fit at all with their religious point of view. That's one thing. And the other thing, which is a much more practical thing, or pragmatic consideration, is that they have a very strong vision of America as being the place of the new Holy Land. They really believe in this, okay? Kaufman Kohler, who is the head of the Hebrew Union College at the time, says something like, we should celebrate, like the 4th of July is the new 6th of Sivan. 6th of Sivan is Shavuot, Pentecost, the day of the Torah was received. And he said we should celebrate the 4th of July as the day the Torah was received. There is a Wursanger that I spoke about previously. It says, I want to invite the sages of the Talmud to walk with me in California. And he says the hills of California is where the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, poured the remain of the beauty of the land. It reminds him of paradise, and he says that very specifically. So they are really bought into this country that is willing to accept them, which is not the case in many other places. And that's another motivation behind the rejection of American Zionism. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Does anybody want to kick in the discussion on binationalism?
Or also there was also the sermon that you had shared about the melting pot as well. Also, that we talk about.
Yeah, I'll say something something about that. The Melting Pot is a play written by Israel Zangwill, which is a British playwright that lives in New York at the time, and it's essentially a play that describes. It's later presented in 1909 and then 1910 in Broadway in New York and in other places across the U.S. And this is essentially a play that puts forward this idea of the melting pot of the melting pot and the Jewish American role in the melting pot. The story is as follows: you have a Jewish immigrant, a Jewish Russian immigrant that comes to New York and falls in love with a Russian girl that is not Jewish. And they're in New York, they're in this new world, in this other space, okay? So this should be a wonderful love story. And until he finds out that the girl's dad was one of the instigators of a pogrom back in Russia that might have even, if I remember correctly, even might have killed some of the members of his own family. So what do you do? What do you do in that such a situation? There's a tension between his loyalty to his old kind of tradition and his concerns. But eventually what happens is that they get married and live happily ever after, and he meets the dad and everything is fine. This was perceived as, in many ways, first of all, as the power of the American melting pot to overcome, the tragic history of Europe. We're in a new place now, America is different, and we can just integrate. But this also raised concerns about this integration, about the possibility of integrating into American society without necessarily maintaining the Jewish identity. And this is what Magnus picks upon, to essentially discuss Zionism and also promote it in the way that I showed here. But he also pushes forward one other metaphor I wanted to explain, which is the orchestra metaphor. This is a metaphor that was later used by a person called Horace Kallen in 1915, and it's a very famous idea of American Zionism, which later is also adopted by Brandeis, who was a judge, Supreme Court judge, and the leader of American Zionism in 1916 and onwards for a few years. And the idea is this: the idea says that America is like an orchestra, okay? And in the orchestra, every player plays his own instrument, and by playing your instrument to the best of your abilities, you're actually promoting the best music, and you're actually contributing to the creation of what's called the American Symphony. This also appears, by the way, in the play itself, okay? So the American Symphony is created by the Italians and the Polish and the Irish and the Jews, each playing their own instrument to their best ability. This is called, this is the orchestra metaphor, or it's also called, it's a pluralism kind of idea promoted by Kallen, and Magnus finishes his speech by giving that idea as well. And this later spills over into Brandeis's very famous American quote about American Zionism, which goes something like the following. Essentially, he says, in order to be a better American, you need to be a better Jew. Okay, that's the orchestra metaphor we are talking about. And in order to be a better Jew, you need to be a Zionist. So Zionism within American Zionism, the context of American Zionism in the early teens and the 20s becomes this idea about Zionism making you a better Jew, Zionism being something that promotes your relation, your integration, your maintenance of your Jewish identity, and by being a Zionist, by maintaining your Jewish identity, you are actually contributing to cultural pluralism, which is the model, the suggested model by Kallen and by Dewey, by the way, and others at the time for the American society. So this is like the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, right? You know, we can think about what is the importance of these metaphors, right? That fundamentally it's a question of, you know, do people believe that the process of immigration is about melting everything together into something new, or about contributing something to, you know, like you said, the American Symphony? And there are other metaphors as well, you know. But I think that part of what's interesting to me about that document, also, you know, about that sermon, is that Magnus is concerned, you know, about Jews losing their distinctiveness, right? You know, he has this sense of nationalism, the sense of peoplehood, you know, that he fears that if Jews lose their distinctiveness, that they will lose their sense of self. Anyway, I know Pierce also, you had your hand up for a minute. Do you want to ask something about this specifically, or you know, going back to some of the other things that people had mentioned earlier?
It was just more a general question, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So while Magnus was in Palestine, if you're trying to promote a Jewish like society or a nation, why promote it as a binationalistic like Zionism rather than just a Jewish peoplehood where like people are Jews from all over the world and feel that they have a home, rather than just it being American like Jewish kind of peoplehood?
Okay, great. That's a great question. I want to say two things about this. One of them is about the demographics of Palestine, of pre-state Palestine, that I think want us to have in the background, and then I'll address the question itself. The Jews are a minority in Palestine up until 1949. Okay, so just prior to 1948, the Jews were about 1/3 of the population. And a lot of the discussion about binationalism and it also ties into discussions of immigration and the question of when will there be a Jewish majority? Because if you're a Democrat, like Magnus is, you know, you're concerned about democracy as well. And I think the thing that this is actually trying to address is you know, what's called the Arab question in Zionism. What do you do with the fact that, you know, there is another people in Palestine once you arrive? Obviously, you know, it would have been easier from the Zionism can evolve in and of itself without dealing with this question. And, you know, it's legitimate form of Jewish restoration and nationalism and returning to Palestine, but there is a problem that was in that process, and that problem kind of triggered many responses. One of them is let's say Jabotinsky's what's called Iron Wall response, which says we need to fight it till the end here in Palestine. It's, if I put it very bluntly. There's more pragmatic kind of Zionist approach by Ben-Gurion, which kinds of mostly is about economic integration. It's about showing the Arabs in Palestine and the world that there can be economic benefits from the Zionist project, and therefore, they will join from that consideration. And then there are various people in Magnus, one of them, which kind of say, this is the Lackmus test of Zionism. We need to find a solution, a long-term solution that will enable Jews and Arabs to live together in Palestine. At the time, binationalism is perceived as the format of that idea. Just to say that today there might also be a two-state solution in current terms would probably have been acceptable by Magnus as well. He was concerned about the moral justice aspect of this discussion.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions? I have a follow-up question about binationalism, but I want to give you guys a chance. Yeah, Bella, go ahead.
Just along the same vein of what we've been talking about, I was curious how maybe non-Jewish Americans were responding to the idea of Zionism.
Thanks. That's a great question. There's two main strands of Christian American thought. I have something, just a minute in my screen. Okay, just a minute. I'll stop my screen from blinking. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So there's two main aspects to this question that have to do with. Remind me the question for a second. I just got carried away by this green screen thing.
How non-Jewish Americans were responding to Zionism.
Yeah, thanks. So there's two aspects to this. One is essentially the evolvement of Christian Zionism. So you have Christian Zionism is a very strong movement, which it has its prominence also in the US today, but has roots in earlier Christian thought that essentially perceives it's tied into evangelical political thought, current evangelical political thought as well, which essentially perceives the return of the Jews to Zion as a preliminary state to the second coming of Christ and to a realization of Christian political theology. And it's a pretty strong movement which is very much invigorated by the Balfour Declaration, which they perceive as pushing forward towards the ingathering of the exiles, which is perceived as part of that plan. So essentially their idea, there is a strong Christian Zionist support that begins around the Balfour Declaration. There is a later form of Christian Zionist support following the Holocaust. There is a movement of about 500,000 Christians for Zion in the 1945, established around 1945-46. And its most prominent spokesman is Reinhold Niebuhr, which is a Christian theologian that the favorite theologian of Barack Obama, by the way, who
also James Comey.
Yeah, of many people. He's a jack of all trades in theology, but he actually talks in front or testifies in front of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in 1946 as well, calling for a just solution for the Jews after the Holocaust. And that's also part of their discussion. There is another strand of Christian religious thought, which are people that are very much inspired by Magnus. One of them is called Holmes, Reverend called Holmes, who visits Palestine in 1929, and then in 1934, he interviews Magnus in the Christian Century, and they are people that they share the prophetic ideas of the binationalists and Magnus as part of the Christian tradition as well. And in sharing that prophetic idea, they are actually they're very strong in promoting Magnus's self-identification as a Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is like this prophetic figure which plays a role both in Christian theology and in Jewish theology, and they keep on speaking about Magnus as like this Jeremiah in Zion, Jeremiah being the kind of a prophet of doom in many ways, that warns the political establishment against the abuse of power. And this is Magnus's kind of view, kind of saying if Zionism will promote itself without finding a moral solution to the Arab question, there will be ramifications. So these are kind of two main Christian, Jewish American Christian aspects of relating to the problem in Palestine.
We have time for probably one more question, if somebody wants to ask something, to kind of wrap us up. I guess I can ask something if nobody else does. I guess one thing that I think is really interesting. Here you mentioned Louis Brandeis. You've mentioned obviously talked extensively about Magnus. One of the things that I've spoken about a little bit is the way in which Brandeis, his ideas about Zionism and the practical development of Palestine, right, are like they don't really come to fruition, right? He's kind of bringing these American ideas, to the Zionist movement. They ultimately don't win out, and the same thing can be kind of said about Magnus to some extent. He's not the only binationalist, right? By any means, but like you said, there are a number of American Jews who are proponents of binationalism. So can you maybe say, like, in like 30 seconds, whatever we have left, like, what is it about the American Jewish experience that is causing American Zionists like Magnus and Brandeis and others to propose ideas that are, very different from what their European counterparts are suggesting, and that a lot of them don't actually end up winning out in terms of the development of Palestine?
Okay, sure. I think there's three main things that come to mind for me. The first one has to do with the issue of capitalism and socialism. This ties a lot into Brandeis's attempt to promote a kind of a capitalist system in Zionism or in Israel, which is at the same time, a very much a socialist ideal, the kibbutz being the center of that, very much a socialist structure. So there's something in the American capitalist economic view which is concerning for the establishment leaders in Palestine, and that it's always in the back of their mind. It's difficult, looking back to understand the extent to which socialism, prevailed at the time. So this is one aspect. The other aspect has to do with the issue of pragmatism in American thought in general, and democracy. And this is essentially, the idea that you can get things better and right by better processes. This also ties into progressivism as well. That, first of all, the idea that there must be a solution to something, and also the idea that that solution is kind of practical, pragmatic, brought into play by processes and establishments that eventually create that realization. So the Americans are trying to promote practical, pragmatic solutions in Palestine. One, for instance, is a big water kind of solution in terms of water infrastructure that's supposed to promote peace in 1947 in Palestine, an American brought idea, okay? So there's a very kind of pragmatic approach in the American mindset, whereas Zionism, both religion and secular, in Palestine at the time has a messianic overtone, okay? It's about redemption. It's about redemption of the Jewish people. It's about redemption of the land. It has much more of that kind of notion, which is not apparent at all in the American side. And the third aspect has to do with, specifically with Magnus and his promotion of binationalism. first of all, the reform underpinnings were not understood. These are the Zionists that are in Palestine, even if they are no longer religious, they come from a religious background, which is very different from the American reform. And they do not accept this religious logic presented by Magnus in promoting his views. They do not see value in the kind of religious theopolitical language, which what I call in the book. They have no buy-in to this idea of prophetic Judaism, the way that it is presented by Reform Judaism. And also, American Jews are very, very few in Palestine at the time, both in terms of leadership, but in general. An American Jew is an oddity in Palestine. You don't get many of them. And they're very lonely. They're very isolated. They don't have there's a rabbi called Trachtenberg that visits Palestine in 1936 on behalf of the CCAR, of the Conference of American Rabbis. And in a letter preparing him for his visit, a friend from Jerusalem writes to him, an American rabbi means nothing here, okay? They don't, there's something about the foreignness, and this is something I echo in the title also, Twice a Stranger, Magnus being a stranger, both as an American and as a Reformed Jew. There's something in the foreignness of American Jews within the context of Zionism, which works against their promotion of their ideas, which, just to summarize this, are perceived sometimes as excessively concerned with a form of religious moralism that is not necessarily, does not echo in the issue in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, so much for joining us, first of all, and also for your thoughtful consideration of all of these issues. The question of Zionism in America and its impact in, British Palestine, later state of Israel, is obviously a huge issue. There's a great deal we could talk about that, endlessly. I feel, probably definitely the two of us, and also the class as a whole. But thank you so much for joining us, and for sharing your insight into these issues. So, and also thanks to all the students and others who joined us, for taking part in this conversation.